I'd like to welcome everybody back today to Alabama Care, and today I have the pleasure of being in Montgomery at the ADRS offices, and we are going to be speaking about deaf services. And I am with Mr. Bedarius Bell, and Mr. Bell is coordinator of ADRS services. Also Mr. Rocky Truman, and Mr. Truman is a deaf support specialist. And here you can see Mr. Josh Brewer, and Josh is the coordinator for ADRS interpreting services. And at this time, even though I've done a quick introduction, I always like to hand it back over and allow you to introduce yourself. Mr. Bell, if you would go ahead and start us off.
Yes. Bedarius Bell, State Coordinator of Deaf Services for the Alabama Department of Rehab.
And are you originally from this area?
No, I actually grew up in Georgia, Gainesville, Georgia. But after high school, I came to Auburn University for school and kind of stayed in the state.
So do you go dogs or do you go Tigers?
I grew up a Dogs fan, but after coming to Auburn, I had to switch allegiances.
Yeah, I'm sure the family has something to say about that.
A little bit.
Mr. Truman, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yep, so my name is Rocky Truman, and I work in the Department of Rehab Services as a deaf support specialist in the Talladega area, and I've been there pretty much all my life. So originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then moved down here with my parents at the early part of my life.
So go Flyers, first and foremost.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, do you get to go to the race that's out in Talladega quite often? Is that a thing?
Yeah, when I was younger, I did. Not as much now. I'm kind of over that. So it's really it's kind of a redneck thing, just to be honest. So I'm not that big of a fan nowadays.
I haven't been to the race in Talladega yet. I've been to the Indy 500 a few times, but it's kind of the same crowd. But I do want to check out the race in Talladega just to say I did it since I'm here in the state. And I think that I will. I've heard it's a party. First, I'll say that.
It's a big time party, yeah.
And Mr. Brewer, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yep. So Josh Brewer, and so the State Coordinator for Interpreter Services, Department of Rehab Services, and I'm an Alabama native. Been here all my life, and I've been interpreting for about 20 years, and with the agency for about 6. So.
Now, so I have to ask: are you Alabama or Auburn?
I'm not into sports.
I like that.
You know, it's kind of a mania that I recognize in other people around me, but I'm not sports don't make sense to me. So, but however, my wife is a huge Auburn fan. She went to Auburn, and I can't begrudge her that.
Yeah.
So I try to support her in her habit.
And
And I don't judge, but personally, I'm not a sports guy. So.
You kind of stay neutral there,
right?
When everybody gets heated.
Yep.
I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about deaf services for people that aren't familiar with it in the state. What exactly are deaf services?
Well, Deaf Services, the Alabama Department of Rehab Services is an organization that helps people with disabilities find employment or help keep the current employment they have. And so we have counselors around the state that work with all different disabilities. Deaf Services, we specialize and focus on people who are deaf or hard of hearing or deaf-blind. And so our main job, the services that we do is, all of it is focused on helping that population to achieve their maximum potential when it comes to employment.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that something that's been around for a while, or is that kind of recent in the last 15, 20 years?
No, it's been around for a while. I'm actually as far as I can go back, I'm the 3rd state coordinator. Earl Lindsay, to my knowledge, was the first, and he was here when I was hired. I've been with the agency 22 years, and so it's been around for a while.
Yeah. As far as compared to maybe some of the other sub-communities that ADRS supports, I feel like blind and deaf would be kind of one of the earlier in that timeline as opposed to like autism.
Well, yeah, definitely deaf and hard of hearing services was probably before autism. Obviously, I think people who were on the spectrum were prevalent. It probably went by another name. in the deaf community, in the past, it was kind of referred to as like low functioning deaf was kind of a term that none of us in the field really liked, but that was kind of the term that was attributed to certain populations.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's more of it's pretty much called like deaf plus other coexisting disabilities.
Okay.
But yeah, so I would say deaf services was around before autism.
Yeah. So it's got a storied history there and a solid foundation.
Right.
Yeah. And then, Mr. Brewer, if you were to introduce us to what interpreting services are.
Yeah, sure, I can. So interpreting services, as I was a staff interpreter when I joined the agency back in 2013, and essentially what we do is for the rehabilitation process, every part of that path where a deaf or hard of hearing person, somebody that uses sign language would communicate with somebody, be it their counselor, a prospective employer,
Mm-hmm.
so that means going to an interview, securing a job, hopefully. So anytime that a deaf person that's being served by the Department of Rehab is communicating with folks, they're going to need an interpreter, and so that would be my role as a staff interpreter, and we have 7 staff interpreters all over the state that cover certain geographical areas. So yeah, it could mean being an interpreter, interpreting for an interview, interpreting for on-the-job training. So that means, I've been in a lot of different employee, a lot of different types of employment.
Yeah.
That way, and I've interpreted, orientation videos and ad nauseum, a lot of the same stuff. However, these are parts of employment that are ubiquitous. Everybody that gets a job goes through this process, but if you're deaf and you're being served by the Department of Rehab Services, you're going to have an interpreter there, so you get every bit of the information you would have if you were a hearing person.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Now, Mr. Truman, I'd like to ask a little bit about that. When I initially hear that, I kind of feel like there are pieces of equipment or software that could really help in that process. Are there instances where someone with the hearing loss can use equipment rather than maybe interpreting services? And how do you feel about that?
Well, in my opinion, I prefer using an interpreter at all times rather than equipment. Interpreters have saved my neck many times. So I like to use interpreters, but I empower the deaf consumers that I work with to be aware of their rights to communication through interpreting or otherwise. So that's my perspective on that.
Are there some instances where equipment can help, maybe if there can't be an interpreter there with you? I remember in middle school, there was a kid in my class who used a keyboard to kind of talk, like a text-to-talk thing. But I feel like there was a lot missed in that.
Mm-hmm. The Ubi Duo is the type of equipment.
Yeah.
There's a lot of deaf people who do use English, so the community varies as far as communication preferences. There's a piece of equipment called a Ubi Duo that uses 2 different keyboards, and they can type back and forth on that, so it can be helpful in certain circumstances. So I've used it myself on occasion, and it helps to communicate, but it really depends on the scenario and the individual.
Yeah, it's not natural. It's not like it flows in. It takes me a lot longer to write something on a computer or in hand,
Right.
rather than just having a conversation like we are today. So I can understand that.
Exactly.
Now,
I love interpreters. That's my number 1 preference.
It's like a tag team.
Exactly. You got it.
Now, what age group do ADRS.Deaf services typically focus around?
Well, we work with employment age people, so we will work with people as early as age 14 in certain instances, depending on the situation, all the way up until old age is as long as a person is employed or want to be employed.
So it really focuses around employment, though.
Right. It's all about employment. So anybody within that realm, age-wise, then we would work with them.
And Would you say most of the people that are coming through your department are new to hearing loss or have had hearing loss for a couple years?
That would be that's kind of a difficult question. We see a wide range. We have a lot of people who are new, who have lost their hearing from, maybe an accident, old age, or maybe it was an undiagnosed hearing loss for a while that they never just received hearing aids. So we have a lot of first-time hearing aid users. We have a lot of people who were born deaf, so they're culturally deaf, and sign language is primary communication. So it just really varies.
You said culturally deaf there. I've never heard that term before. What exactly is that different than?
I'll let Rocky take that.
Sure. Culturally deaf, you've got all kinds of different cultures, Native American cultures, Black culture, white culture. It's just another culture in that continuum, in that mix. So it's deaf people or hard of hearing people who tend to use interpreting, tend to sign for communication primarily. So that's kind of what deaf culture is talking about. And a lot of times the first language will be ASL in deaf culture. For example, in American Sign Language, ASL, it's a lot quicker to communicate. You can just use one sign versus in English you'd have to say a whole sentence.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of part of that language and culture aspect.
I've heard of like Chinese, how the Chinese language is very like one symbol will consume a few different words, so it kind of flows a little easier. And I imagine that ALS is kind of similar in that aspect.
Right.
ASL, I mean.
Right, ASL. It's almost the same as far as it is a different language, American Sign Language, and it's in my opinion it's a lot easier to communicate. It's quicker, and I guess you could say it's similar to Chinese. It's just another language,
Yeah.
So
I recently read a book where it's like the language that you communicate through helps you understand the world around you. Having that different language, you're able to kind of understand, the environment a little bit differently. It kind of, molds your perception.
Definitely. And it's tough, to have that difference. So that's why I like to have interpreters present if I know I'm gonna be interacting with someone that we have a different language or culture. I don't want to just sit there and not understand, and have someone feel sorry for me. I don't like that, way of doing things. I prefer to be, have equal access, and the only thing that we're different on is deaf people can't hear, yes, but it's not a big barrier as far as intelligence or anything like that.
Yeah, totally. Do you find that lip reading is something that helps too, or not? Not as much.
Well, it doesn't help me personally. I'm not a good speech reader. I can pick up easy words like mom, but there are some deaf and hard of hearing who are proficient in speech reading. It just depends. Each person's individual, like I said, but I don't personally use speech reading. I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, I think I would want to use the sign language because it's just a naturally flowing thing there, and you get to pick up on everything that's being said.
Right, that's a keyword, natural. To me, at least, it is.
Yeah. I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about the deaf services. What is the process when someone reaches out to ADRS? What does that look like?
Typically, when somebody reaches out, it could come through a deaf support specialist like Rocky or a counselor. But the first real part of that process is the person will meet with the counselor. The counselor will sit down, get information, determine if the person is eligible for our services, and then determine if they're, and that typically relates to, it's going to relate to their disability. If it's significant enough for VR services to I guess to be applied and work with them, work for them. And so once that person is eligible for services, the counselor and this person will sit down, they will jointly come up with a rehab plan. And the plan is basically a list of services, a pathway, a blueprint for how they're going to get from where they are now to employment. Or if they're already employed, how they're going to maintain that employment. And so once the plan is set up, it'll have a list of services. Those services could include, the purchase of hearing aids. It could include working with a deaf support specialist like Rocky. It could include training, like college training or some kind of other vocational training. And then it'll include job placement if the person doesn't have a job. And so that's kind of the process that goes through. Once the person has a job or services are complete, there's a 90-day window where we're going to follow up the case and make sure that everything's fine. And at the end of that, if there are no other services needed, then we'll close the case.
About how long does that take? I know it's probably very wide right there, but
Yeah, I mean, that is so individualized, because if a person is coming straight out of high school and they want to become, say, an engineer, then that's going to be at least a 4 or 5 year period where we're going to school, we're dealing with all that, and then employment. If it's a person who comes in and already has the job skills to get the type of job they want, then it may take 3 to 6 months for that case to be resolved. So it really just depends on the ultimate goal, the employment goal, and where the person is as far as skills at the time.
Now you mentioned that if someone were to reach out to ADRS.Deaf services, there has to be an eligibility there.
Right.
And what exactly does that eligibility look like? Is it a form of a doctor's note or?
Right. Well, counselors will send. They can request medical records if a person already has them, or they could send a person to a doctor to have medical tests to see. And with us, it's going to be based on the degree of their hearing loss and their functional limitations because of that loss. So basically how that hearing loss impacts their daily living, how it impedes employment or the ability to gain employment, and that will help determine eligibility.
Yeah, okay, so there's a few different factors in there.
Right.
Now you said maintaining employment. What is an example of someone having to get ADRS services to maintain employment?
Yeah, good question. So there are many cases. Before I was a state coordinator, I was also a counselor. And I had cases where we would have maybe law enforcement who over the years had lost hearing and, wasn't really able to function and do the job properly because they couldn't really locate sound in the field.
Yeah.
And obviously that's really important for an officer. So they may need to come in for services to kind of help with hearing aids. If they're a first-time hearing aid user, counselors are going to do a lot of counseling with them as far as what to expect from hearing aids, knowing that they're not going to restore all of your hearing, but they're going to be able to, in most cases, give you enough that you can kind of function again. So in situations like that,
Yeah.
somebody who has a job, but because of the hearing loss kind of decreasing, just figuring out a way to help maintain because they can't function the same way they could before.
I think that was a really good example. Like if you've been to the firing range or in the line of duty, maybe
Right.
the gun's going off by your ear a little bit too much, and
Right.
in order to be proficient at your job, I can see that.
Right.
Yeah, I was wondering that. Now it seems like if somebody is coming to ADRS, they are looking for support and they're eager to get employment. I don't feel like that would be. It is a process there, but all parties are willing and working together.
Right.
Now the other part of that is implementing that in either the college or the workplace. What are those other parties like? Are they receptive, or sometimes do you receive some pushback?
Well, yeah, I'll talk about the colleges, and Rocky maybe can talk about his experience with employers because I think that it always varies. With say colleges, there are certain colleges that I think now we probably have better services around the state in most of the colleges. Most colleges have some kind of disability support service that may be more willing or knowledgeable about deaf services or the needs of people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So they're willing to make sure that there's a qualified interpreter in the classroom. Make sure that students are going to have maybe extra time on tests if they need that. But every now and again, you may run into a college who doesn't have the resources, or maybe they don't aren't knowledgeable enough to provide good services. And so, you know, we work with colleges. We help explain what our services are, how we can partner to help them when it comes to resources, even when it comes to just knowledge about a particular student.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing with employment. I'll let Rocky talk about that.
Sure. So part of it is, you know, we have to sell ourselves to the employer to show that, you know, for instance, I'm able to do the job, and I'm able to kind of introduce them to what deafness or hard of hearing means, and show them that our consumer is able to do the job as well. So a lot of times we'll run into employers that are real comfortable hiring deaf or hard of hearing consumers, and some are not. So we have to know how to work with them and approach it in the right way, and, you know, demonstrate that it's something that can be done, and, you know, it's not an issue. So, and then they'll get used to it, be more receptive. So, and with our interpreters as well being present, it helps the employer to kind of get an idea of what it looks like as far as being deaf or hard of hearing. So I'll bring an interpreter with me on a regular basis when I go to meet with employers, and then I'll kind of fade out and let the employee, you know, do their job after they get some of that initial training.
And one thing I want to add, because Rocky is really he was our first deaf support specialist that we hired when the position was created. So he's been here, I think Rocky said 17 years, working with the
17
agency.
years.
And so he's seen a lot. He's been into, you know, a lot of employers' offices. And so part of the idea, my predecessor, Tammy Adams, is the one that created the DSS position. Part of the idea was having a deaf person who's in this position to kind of go and help do the job placement. So when an employer who may not have ever met a deaf person before, they're seeing a person like Rocky, somebody who's professional, so they automatically can understand that, oh, it wouldn't be hard to have a deaf person here. You know, you have a person that comes in that's professional, can communicate with them, even though a person may not know sign language. Rocky is an excellent communicator. And so I think it kind of puts people's nerves at ease, employers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really helps. And so we have 9 DSSs, deaf support specialists around the state. They're not all deaf, but the majority of them are deaf.
Now, Rocky, Bedarius was just saying that you're an excellent communicator, even if the person doesn't understand sign language. What are some other ways of communication there that you've found to be very effective?
Well, gesturing is something that I'm pretty good at with other people. Being a deaf person and growing up deaf, you know, I'm able to gesture and kind of get the point across a lot of times. And if I work with an employer, for example, without an interpreter, then I'm able to kind of, you know, get along with them as far as communication-wise. But a lot of times I will have an interpreter.
Yeah. So it's almost,
Does that make sense?
yeah, it's almost like if an interpreter is not always available, there's kind of a new language that you and your coworkers form together. Either they're learning some sign language or they're learning some of.
Well, common sense kind of factors in too with that, you know, to make sure that they understand, the employee understands, you know, if you sign stocking or things that are more visual and gestural, then it's more, it's easier to get your point across in that regard. So I may be signing to the consumer, to the employee, or gesturing with them if the language is an issue, if they don't know American Sign Language. But it's never something that really is a barrier there.
Mm. I like that you say it's not really a barrier, because I feel like that is a mental mindset that is very powerful.
Right. It's all about how you approach it and your attitude. Attitude is number one. Exactly.
What would you say to? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just saying that's how I approach things, is to have a good attitude, and you'll break down barriers easily that way with employers and anybody you come in contact with. And I'm able to ensure that the employee knows their job and make sure that they are trained, and, you know, they have a right to communication. So we'll bring in interpreters if needed And then I'll kind of fade out, like I said earlier, to let them do their job without assistance.
Now, what would you say to somebody that is maybe looking for employment and has some hearing loss, but is nervous about taking those steps?
I'll tell them, oh, just be yourself. Please just be yourself. It's not anything to be nervous about. You know, if you go into an interview with a room full of people, you know, of course you're going to be a little nervous, but just practice the interview. We'll practice together beforehand and make sure they feel confident. Sometimes it'll happen where the person interviewing will look at me and say, oh, what do I do? What do I do? But you just have to be confident and don't worry about it. You know, keep eye contact. And I work with the consumers on all of those things to get them ready and empower them for the interviews and for their employment.
So you'll spend a lot of time pre-interview really getting to know the person, taking them through what to wear, how to behave in there, and
Exactly.
that's like a personal life coach.
Well, it is in many ways. Independent living skills factor in. You know, it's about jobs, but it also has to do with other factors too. So to get them ready for employment.
Yeah, it's like who they have to become in order to secure that job is who they'll be throughout their life.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a building thing.
Absolutely.
Now,
You have a lot of success stories out there. So.
speaking of, well, before we get into success stories, I'll ask about a few different success stories that you guys would like to share. How about, how difficult is it to find, like if someone comes and says, I want to find employment, matching them correctly with what they want to do and the right business? I find that a little hard to say. You'd have to really dig in on what do you want to do, because, you know, maybe you want to do, you know, coloring books, but that's not viable for a living, you know, so you kind of have to, you know, find something there.
Right.
Right. You've got to look at what jobs are out there in the marketplace, what's available, and see what they can get their feet into, get some experience developed if they don't have that experience yet in a job, and then you know, they'll work their way into a job that they may be more interested down the road. You know, that's kind of how it works.
Yeah.
So,
Is that what you were kind of looking for?
yeah, so it sounds like you kind of, in order for that person to figure out what it is, they should get experience early and often, and kind of build upon that.
Right, that's very important.
So
It is. Experience is important, and to get your feet in the door and get some experience, and you know, then that'll build some confidence, and figuring out what you want to do down the road. You know, if someone says to me, you know, I want to be an engineer, I may not know myself how to be an engineer, but I can help guide them, and I can have that good attitude and get them in the door to proceed in the field that they're interested in.
I feel like you probably know about 100 different occupations going through, you know, what's required through the interview process with people, so you probably know every occupation in the state of Alabama.
Well, definitely several. I see our consumers getting all types of employment. I've worked with a lot of different companies and a lot of businesses, so we look to see what matches them the best in our position.
One of the things that we also,
And that just kind of comes natural to me.
Yeah.
one of the things that we're able to do also is we work closely like with the School for the Deaf and other schools around the state with students at an early age. We're able to do vocational evaluations with them and kind of start helping them think about their interests and how those interests match up with employment. And like Rocky said, one thing that's really important is the job market. If you want to stay in Talladega, then, you know, that job market, there are certain jobs that are in that area, you got to know what you're going to fit into there.
Right.
If a person wants to go to college and get a degree and they're willing to move, then, you know, opens up different possibilities as well. So Yeah.
Now, what age do you start to do that, work with the high school kids?
Well, with the School for the Deaf, we're able to start working with them. Ninth grade, they'll do a vocational evaluation in the ninth grade. They'll also do one their senior year.
Okay.
It's not enough of us as Deaf Services to do every high school like that, but whenever we can meet students and work with them early, we try to start off with a vocational evaluation. And so I think that just kind of gives them that solid foundation, or at least a start, a baseline. And then they can figure out where they're going next and compare that senior year to their freshman year, how they've improved, what skills they've gained, and where they want to go from there.
So you're continuing starting maybe freshman year, and then, it's an ongoing process.
It's an ongoing process, right?
Yeah. Now, it sounds like there are a ton of supports and services available through ADRS. Who pays for all of this? Is it the consumer that pays, like an hourly thing, or how is this?
The majority of our services are there are many of our services that are going to be free. There are some services that will be based on a person's income, and it may be a sliding scale depending on their income. But the majority of our services are free, and to me, I think some of the most valuable services is the expertise of our staff, whether it's the interpreters or DSS or VR counselors, and so that's always going to be a free service.
Now, is there a limit to that, though? Because you said there's about 9 individuals throughout the state. How many people qualify through ADRS.Deaf services?
I would say, I think we probably work new cases every year. Probably, it just depends, maybe between 600 and 700 probably new cases around the state every year.
Yeah.
At any given time around the state, we probably have maybe 2,200 cases that are open.
So you got, with 9 people, 2,200?
Well, we've got 16 rehab counselors. So looking at deaf services overall, we have 16 rehab counselors. We have 9 deaf support specialists. We have 11 staff interpreter positions.
Okay.
We have 5 staff audiologists. We have evaluators. I might be missing somebody, but we have it's a team.
Okay.
It's not just the deaf support specialist, and then on top of that, we also can work with our partners, the Alabama Institute for Deaf and Blind. Work with them really closely. Certain areas have other community rehab programs that they work with, and we're able to use their services to work with the people. So. It's a partnership, a lot of partnerships throughout the state, not just our staff.
Gotcha. Does that seem, if there were only 9 people for 2,200,
Right.
That's a huge caseload. I don't know
Yeah.
how you guys would be here with me right now.
Yeah, Rocky would be asking for raises all the time. I wouldn't be able to afford him.
Exactly.
I would like to hand it back over, and if you guys could share a few success stories, maybe one from high school to getting a new job or maintaining a job, few success stories that really come to mind. And Rocky, if you'd like to start off.
Sure. There's so many, but I'll just choose one to speak about. I've worked with one consumer for 7 years, and or they have worked at their job for 7 years, and they're able to do the job, and their employer just absolutely loves them. So, it's a simple thing, they just follow the rules and do what they're supposed to be doing in their job, and, use common sense like everybody has. And I just feel like they've been working there 7 years straight, and that's just I think that's amazing. And I help empower them to, if they need an interpreter for a meeting or what have you, they'll contact an interpreter and get one out there, and just everything is working smoothly, and it's just I just use common sense in that scenario, but I think it's great to see that.
We have thinking about like some of the high school, and Rocky I know he'll have a ton of these stories because where he works, he's there really close to the School for the Deaf. But just thinking about the students who come through there in the last 17 years, Rocky, I know we've had students who've come out of that high school who've gone on to become lawyers, students who've gone on to become engineers, and just, I mean, any job you can think of. I'm sure somebody has come from the School for the Deaf, or obviously one of our high schools here, and overcame whatever barriers that were there. One story that comes to mind that's kind of unique. These are unique stories to me. We have a situation, a older gentleman who spoke Mandarin, had a hearing loss, and working in a restaurant, and wasn't able to take orders. It was a family-owned restaurant, but wasn't able to really take orders, the customers' orders, and do those things. Staff in that area got involved, were able to help with technology, help with some of the training with that, and give him that sense of pride and dignity of being able to contribute to this family business now. Mm-hmm. But it took us bringing in an interpreter who was a Mandarin interpreter, not a sign language interpreter,
yeah.
to make that happen. And those situations kind of pop up a lot now because of the diversity of Alabama. You may have a sign language interpreter and a Spanish interpreter in the same room, mm-hmm. and you have all these languages going on so that our staff can kind of do what they do. So those things are pretty fascinating, just having all of that and making all of that work and dealing with the different cultures, and then also applying that to the culture of the business that you're trying to get them in, because that's also a different culture that you have to figure out how to fit into. So a lot of success stories like that.
When you were saying there that there's like a Mandarin interpreter and a sign language interpreter, and then the business culture there, it made me think of like a train, a locomotive that has a boxcar, and it kind of, that language goes through that interpretation,
right?
And it goes through there. You mentioned that there was some technology that really helped that individual with that family business. Mm-hmm. What are some examples, or what was that specific example?
In that specific example, we were looking at hearing aids, FM systems, which is another device that kind of helps amplify sound in different situations. Mm-hmm. So different devices like that would kind of help. Amplified telephones, so they can actually answer here on the phone. Mm. So you've got all of these devices that need to work together, all this equipment that needs to work together in order to help this person perform the duties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that equipment's available through ADRS sometimes?
Right, sometimes it is. And because we have staff audiologists, we're able to kind of provide a lot of these things at a really reduced rate, as opposed to if they went to an outside audiologist or a vendor. So it saves the state money and allows us to provide more, have better use of our taxpayer dollars.
Oh, the funds, they keep the money in Alabama and use it, yeah. Right. That makes sense. Are there any occupations that somebody with hearing loss you wouldn't recommend going into? Is there any one of those? Or is it every occupation is open?
I think every occupation's open. There's no restrictions as far as that goes. The way I see it, it's all open.
Yeah, I agree.
I've never seen anything like a piece of equipment, but I imagine that maybe some haptic feedback types of equipment could help on some work sites or job sites where direct line of sight and there might be some danger, like, hey, we got to get out of here. A crazy movie thing if they're working on offshore drilling or something and it's like, hey, you need to get off the rig right now. Or is haptic feedback a thing?
Maybe in certain.
And I'm going like way out left field,
Never used haptic feedback on that.
Yeah. Maybe.
Maybe in certain situations, but in that scenario that you kind of painted, maybe instead of haptics, it may be flashing lights. So
very
maybe
good.
a visual signal instead of something that's kind of vibrating.
Yeah.
So there's always workarounds, those kind of things, and I think that's why Rocky and I both think that there's probably no job that's not available to a person with a hearing loss, because there's always either technology or innovation of, especially our staff, DSSs, rehab engineers that are part of the overall work with everybody in our agency. They're pretty innovative and can come up with ways to accommodate just about anything.
Right. They are, and like welding, some people view welding as dangerous for a deaf or hard of hearing person. You can put flashing lights up. You know, they've got different colored lights you can put up. So, you know, there's one is the fire alarm, one's the, you know, weather, and then one is, you know, if someone needs your attention, they can push a button or something and get your attention. So that's one of the types of accommodations with technology that we provide.
That's a perfect example, something that I wouldn't necessarily think about because I've never been in that scenario. But I think the different lights and the visuals would be something that would be, you know, would work very well there.
Right.
Right, to have those three. Sometimes you've got four, but you can also work it with three. So. If I see a fire alarm in a business with lights, you know, automatic flashing lights with a fire alarm, I think that's a wonderful accommodation to have for deaf people too, because you know we're very visual. So.
Is there one accommodation that you've seen that you wish was everywhere? Like the flashing lights for the fire alarms, or is there one that you're like, this is a great thing?
The lights.
The lights.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, that's for safety as well, you know, for the deaf employees or hard of hearing employees. Like in an oil rig or, you know, welding scenarios, you know, safety is real important. So having a light is going to help that, and also having an interpreter too for the training and for any kind of meetings or what have you.
And I think,
because, you know, they have a right to communication in that environment, so, you know, having an interpreter really helps everything flow well. So that's that's what I believe.
and with the situation with the lights, you know, that's one of those things that even hearing people would benefit from.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
you don't have to have a hearing loss to also be,
Right.
to take advantage of those things.
Absolutely.
Nowadays, we all have technology kind of at our fingertips, and I feel like a lot of the companies are kind of at the forefront of making accommodations for people that have hearing loss or some other types of things. What company do you think is kind of at the, do you love for what they're doing? None good.
I'm not really sure on that.
No, I've heard that Apple might be. I've heard that Apple's pretty good on some of their.
Yeah, they do have, Apple with the iPhones.
Yeah, I was gonna say Apple probably.
I'm not a tech person.
No?
So, technology's not my thing.
Yeah, Apple's been
Sorry.
pretty innovative with some of their technology. And the great thing about Apple, with them including a lot of that in their products, is that, you know, people don't have to bring around some device that doesn't look like something that everybody else has.
Mhm.
If you got an iPhone and you're able to use that with speech to text or whatever, I mean, you got a phone the same as the person who's sitting across from you that may not have a hearing loss. So it just kind of, you know, doesn't isolate people as much.
That's what I think is really cool. My aunt, my family member, she uses a Tech Talk to communicate sometimes. Now she hates it. But it's a big boxy thing. I mean, it's probably this, you know, deep and this high. But it's like an out of place in some scenarios there. And I think some of the new technology coming out is very cool in that it's at your fingertips and can help with some of those things.
Right.
Yeah. I've heard. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Was there?
You know, we also have video phones. Like back in the day, we had to use these big pieces of equipment to use the phone lines, to type through the phone lines to communicate. But now we have video phones. So technology is really improving. It's improving a lot. And, you know, I'm able to use my native language to communicate through a video phone to someone else.
FaceTime too.
I was just going to ask.
FaceTime as well, right.
Do you use a lot of FaceTime?
I do. I'm starting to. Starting to use FaceTime with consumers. If English is not their strong point, then we'll communicate with FaceTime. It works real well.
Yeah.
You know, it's another option besides video phone.
Yeah. I imagine the FaceTime would be really cool. As long as you had a stand for your phone. Can you sign with one hand? Is that?
Sure. Or I could set it on the table and sign with both hands. Either way. But you can sign with one hand and get your point across very
Yeah.
easily. So.
Yeah.
I have several deaf friends that will sign while they're driving with FaceTime.
Oh, my
FaceTime
goodness.
That's a big thing, right? I guess it's just like texting and driving a call, and it's like, oh, you're scaring me to death.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it happens.
Yeah, you're right.
I'd be like, pull over to the side of the road.
That's a problem.
I've heard in some instances that if one sense is kind of dampened, that another sense or the other senses will kind of be heightened. Do you see that in the community? Is that a real thing? Like,
Well,
Like
You have
if your
an
vision is like if you're deaf, maybe you're saying like your vision is better.
yeah, or if you're blind, maybe your hearing
Right.
is.
Yeah.
So a lot more goes to the visual then.
Yeah, it's real. If you lose an eye, you know, it's a lot harder as a deaf person. So you do rely a lot on your vision, and got to be careful with my eyes.
It's not like you can smell if lunch is ready, or not like superhero powers. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Your hands too. You know, they're important to have your hands to communicate, visual and the manual part of it. So most people, you've got deaf people and blind people, and sometimes people say that they'd rather be deaf than blind, and hearing people would rather be blind than deaf. So it just depends on that perspective, because hearing people like to listen to music, so that's their perspective with that, and deaf people have their perspective on, you know, vision. They highly value
Each
their
person.
vision. So
Each person has their own kind of, this is how I want it to be. What are some cool new things coming out in the deaf community that you guys are excited about? Maybe some new programs that are coming out in the next 6 months to 5 years, some of the stuff you're seeing at the federal level, and then here in the state of Alabama.
Well, one thing I can think of right off is it seems like emergency preparedness is taking some huge leaps forward when it comes to the deaf community. New technology, new research going into how to alert people, especially here in Alabama, we get tons of tornadoes. And so being able to have equipment or technology or systems that are alerting people with that are deaf or hard of hearing when bad weather is coming, where to go, that to me is huge. You know, we were all employed when the tornadoes came through Tuscaloosa, and a lot of our staff, especially staff in Tuscaloosa, you know, they literally went to houses after the tornadoes to check on some of the consumers that we work with. And so after that, you know, we really tried to work with Department of Public Health and other agencies to figure out systems and ways to communicate. Now the University of Alabama has a professor there who's a CODA, meaning a child of a deaf adult. So his parents were deaf. And he's into, I think he's in the communication department, but has written several grants to help with developing technology and all of this when it comes to emergency preparedness. So that's one thing that kind of jumps out to me.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool thing because, like you said, here in this building, if there's a fire alarm going off, the lights, they help everybody.
Right.
And so if there's new technology coming out for like deaf or hearing loss, it really benefits everybody there.
Benefits everybody, correct.
And it can be incorporated. Funny story, when I first got to Alabama, it was the first Wednesday I was in Alabama, and I heard this alarm going off, and I thought it was an atomic bomb alarm or something, because I'd never heard it before, and nobody warned me about it. I thought for sure we were going into Armageddon, nuclear, you know, World War III stuff.
Yeah.
But there's got to be then some companies out there that are doing the installations on individual homes for the tornado.
Right.
Stuff.
Right. So one thing that we've been able to do as an agency is we partner with the National Weather Service in different parts of the state to do training, weather spotter training, so that we can kind of teach the deaf and hard of hearing community how to spot the weather, understand the weather that you're seeing outside. And in those trainings, we're able to give weather radios and strobe lights, help them program them so that they can, they'll also print out a readout of tornado or whatever the emergency is. The lights will flash and that sort of thing. So that's part of one of the things we do. Another really cool technology I just thought about, it's not there yet, but it's a lot of people are working trying to develop it. Apps and different technology that can turn basically voice into sign, or different
Oh, that
things
would
like
be really cool.
So that's, I mean, it's really, I don't know how close we are to really getting that to a point where it would be, perfect and people can walk around and communicate with somebody who doesn't know sign language or vice versa. But there's a lot of research development going towards these things, and so eventually there will be some kind of real solid breakthrough.
That would be like an Apple or a Google glasses where
Right.
your buddy's talking right next to you and the sign's coming up on the side of the glasses or something.
Yeah.
That would be like.
There's been a lot of talk about that and some research toward those ends. So yeah.
Right. They're working on that still. There's all kinds of technologies that they're working on with glasses and trying to save resources as far as that goes.
Yeah, that would be really cool. This is kind of a left field question, but what questions do people with a hearing loss get that they find most annoying?
Well, a lot of times people will apologize. Oh, I'm sorry you're deaf. And sometimes I might respond, oh, I'm sorry you're hearing. It's not something to feel sorry about. It's just a natural thing. There are all kinds of people out there, all kinds of individuals. Some deaf people quit their jobs, but also hearing people quit their jobs. You've got lower functioning deaf people. You've also got lower functioning hearing people. So it's really the same.
Yeah. And Nathan, Nathan is one of our equipment specialists, is our equipment specialist. Nathan had a question. We were driving down to Montgomery today that he would like to ask.
Yeah, I think that kind of, the last question kind of sort of answered it, but my question would be is what is something that you wish that hearing able people would know about being deaf?
The deaf people are just like everybody else. They're normal, just like you are, just like we all are. I was born deaf and I grew up deaf, so one thing for myself, I wish I'd been in the military, or a police officer, but I'm deaf, so I just have to move on. But that's the same with hearing people too. That's kind of how I look at it.
Mm-hmm. So, don't make it awkward. It doesn't have to be awkward. Why, just be cool.
Exactly, yeah. Right, be cool.
But I feel like sometimes the general society, if we're not familiar with something, our immediate reaction is to kind of take a step back because it's something new for us. Whether it's, if you've never seen the color blue, the first time you see it, you're like a little taken back. I'm not sure what's going on here. What is something that we can do to kind of, I think it's about awareness and interaction there to kind of help that.
Well, I'm deaf, it's not a big deal. I'll just tell somebody I'm deaf, and you don't have to avoid me or you don't have to feel awkward, and everybody's an individual, everybody's different. So when I met you, it wasn't a big deal. So it's just the same with anybody else. Just, you don't have to feel like it's a big deal or feel awkward about it. So just, if you meet an animal, like you've never seen a certain kind of animal before, it takes a little time to get to know them. You meet a new dog or a new cat, so it's just the same with other people too.
And I think the thing that Rocky and our other deaf support specialists are doing to address that is helping people get jobs in all kinds of professions. You know, maybe you've never seen a deaf doctor or a deaf lawyer before, but they're out there. So,
Right.
you know, the more you see deaf people interacting in all aspects of life, the more normal it becomes. And it's just another thing. It's like blue eyes or brown eyes at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Rocky, you're a very confident man, but there may be some kids out there, you know, elementary, middle school, high school, that aren't as confident and haven't gone through those experiences yet. What would you say to them?
Just be yourself. You know, everything's okay. Take it easy. Some people have those resistance factors, or you know, they're resistant to deaf people. But just give it time. You know, don't try to twist their arm to accept you. But you know, just keep open and give them time, and just be cool about it. And I think everything will be all right.
I think when kids come and they interact with Rocky and some of our other staff, and they just see this is a deaf professional just like them, a deaf person that's successful, then that alone, just having Rocky walk into a room is a confidence builder.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. It's important just to come up and meet the person, just like you would anybody else, just like you would meet a hearing person or someone who's a different race or whatever. So.
Yeah, and I imagine during those times, it's very important for the family to know how to navigate kind of that timeline and support their child. Does ADRS work with the family in that capacity?
Well, there's. I guess it just depends. You know, if they're younger. You know, I grew up at a deaf school, so I've seen a lot growing up. You know, from all levels of intelligence. You know, some of the parents would come and drop their kids off at the school, but you know, I just want to show people that I'm able to do things anybody else can. You know, my mom worked as a dorm supervisor at the school for the deaf, and so yeah, I mean.
And as an agency, you know, we have early intervention, we have children's rehab, and they're all under the ADRS umbrella. So they're at different points. All of our staff, I think, are knowledgeable enough in deaf services that they work with the families at these younger ages, and they try to help them transition, and we try to move them through the agency until they get to us at 14 or 16. So yeah, so I think the families are involved. You know, definitely when we're working with younger consumers, then family is probably more involved in some of those situations.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is a part of what we do.
So if somebody has a child with hearing loss, definitely contact ADRS. There may be under a different department in early intervention or things like that, which will eventually move along into deaf services, vocational rehab, stuff
Right.
like that.
Right.
But don't hesitate to call, I'm guessing.
Right, yeah, don't hesitate to call, regardless of what stage or what age your child is in. Your child is.
Okay, I'd like to kind of hand it back to the viewers. If anybody has a specific question that they would like to ask any of the guests on today, please go ahead and type it in. I see we have a couple people in the chat saying hello. Holly Cawthorn, thank you for being here with us. Full Life Ahead, always Tammy, Vonda, good to see you guys. And Ashley Now, I hope I'm saying that correctly. If there's anything specific that you would like to ask, please go ahead and do that. And at this point, I would like to kind of say, what would you like to say to the community if they're watching now or if they'll watch this video later? What would you guys kind of like to do as an outro statement? And we'll start off with Rocky.
Well, I appreciate you all watching today, and thank you for your time. Thank you for watching, and I just want to be here to show you that deaf people are able to do anything anybody else can do. But thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, I think that's a great statement. We definitely would like people to know that the spectrum of people who are deaf and hard of hearing is just as varied as any other population. And our agency is here to help people in all aspects, but specifically with deaf services, to help them find employment. And we want to do that in
Right.
any profession. Our staff are very capable. They've seen it all.
Yeah.
And they've worked in every profession from STEM careers to, to medical to whatever. And so, yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to us if we have services that can benefit you or somebody in your family or a friend.
Yeah, pick up the phone, go to the website.
Go to the website, contact us, email.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very cool. Okay, there aren't any questions in the chat at this time. Feel free to comment later if you guys would like on the video, and maybe I can forward the questions to you guys, and
Absolutely.
we can get some answers like that. Would be really cool.
Sure.
At this time, we are going to go ahead and stop the stream. I'd like to thank everybody for being here with us, and we will be back next week. So I'll see you guys then.